Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of Columbia, DC, and a graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our partners for this evening and for this event, Yale, MIT, and Brown University Clubs of Washington, DC, and their members for being with us this evening. We are very privileged to have Nicholas Fox Weber, Executive Director of the Josef and Annie Albers Foundation, and Barry Bergdoll, Meyer Schapiro Professor of Art History and Archaeology, to discuss Annie and Josef Albers, their lives, their art, their education, and their legacy. And I also would like to add that this event, in major part, was inspired by Weber's most recent meticulously researched and elegant book, Equal and Unequal. The link to this book is provided on our website, or you can simply Google it. I highly encourage everyone to check it out. It's exquisite. Before we can start, please allow me to very briefly spend a couple of minutes to introduce our speakers. Nicholas Fox Weber is the director of Josef and Annie Albers Foundation. He's a graduate of Columbia College and Yale University and received his PhD from University of Groningen. He's the author of 14 books, including biographies of Bauhaus and Le Corbusier, and numerous exhibition catalogs. His writing has also appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times, Los Angeles Times, Wall Street Journal, Le Monde, Art News, Town and Country, and Vogue, among other publications. He's married to the novelist Catherine Weber, has 2 adult daughters, and lives in Connecticut, Paris, and Southwest Ireland, which from where he is actually calling in this evening. And Barry Bergdoll is Meyer Schapiro Professor of Art History and Archaeology and Director of Undergraduate Studies at Columbia University. Trained in art history rather than architecture, he has an approach most closely allied with cultural history and the history and sociology of professions. In exhibitions at the Canadian Centre for Architecture and at the Museum of Modern Art, where he served as Philip Johnson Chief Curator from 2007 to 2013, Bergdoll has offered a series of exhibitions intended to offer more inclusive visions of subjects from Mies van der Rohe, the Bauhaus, L'Auguste, Le Corbusier, Latin American post-war architecture, and most recently, Frank Lloyd Wright. Without further ado, here is on to you.
Thank you. Maybe I will lead off because besides, it's such a huge pleasure to see Nicholas as a dear friend, but we haven't seen one another like so many friends during this difficult time. And so we have to settle for being on screen at the moment, but of course we can't see all of the rest of you, but we're looking forward to your questions. He and I talked about this a little bit ahead of time and renewed many of our passionate discussions that we want to share with you tonight. But for me, I wanted to focus around this book. So I hope it will drive everyone to obtain a copy. It's a way to have an Albers museum and an Albers exhibition in your house. It's such a absolutely extraordinary object. But I wondered, Nicholas, if you could start off just by telling us a bit about your latest deep dive into these 2 protean figures of artistic creativity and modernism, how you conceived the book. I really wish we were in a room because the book is such an exquisite physical object that it is itself an art project and an homage to these figures to begin with. But I want to provoke you also by elucidating for us the subtitle, Equal and Unequal.
Well, Barry, the book in many ways has been in preparation for 50 years, but not by plan, because I met Annie and Josef in 1972, and my acquaintance with them really nourishes the entire publication. I should also add that I've rarely enjoyed such a spectacular collaboration with the publisher. The editors were actively involved and very responsive to what I would call my idiosyncratic way of doing things, which was to suddenly remember funny stories about Annie or Joseph, sometimes very personal anecdotes, and they responded quickly. As for the title, Equal and Unequal, you need to picture the Albers' house, which was incredibly austere. It looked really nice. It was a very ordinary raised ranch house. When I first went there, I thought I would be arriving at the Bauhaus. I thought I'd be arriving at something that looked like a building by Gropius, you know, flat white roofs and so on. And instead, I arrived at a house that was the type that we all know from American television shows of the 60s and 70s, and sort of Band-Aid colored shingles. And it was a raised ranch. And inside, it was incredibly austere. In the living room, there were 4 homages to the square by Joseph, but otherwise, the only art were some student pieces, and the only textiles, here Annie was the greatest textile artist of the 20th century, the only textiles were Venetian blinds, plastic, in the living room, and roller blinds in the bedrooms. Annie's bedroom closely resembled a hospital room. Nothing on the walls, very functional utilitarian furniture, office furniture where other people would have had dressers. And she had one painting hanging in the room. And it was a marvelous painting, it is a marvelous painting, called Equal and Unequal, which Joseph had painted in 1939. And somewhere in the course of the years, I was looking at that painting, as I often did, and thinking of Annie saying that she would lie in her bed and look at it and never stop being fascinated by it. There are 2 principal forms. They seem to be magnetically attracted to each other and at the same time almost pushing each other away. And the painting always hung with really unattractive picture wire suspended from a hook on the molding, because the Alberses didn't believe that you should make holes in the walls. You should be prepared to move on quickly in life. But one day I was looking at this painting of 2 abstract forms, both monumentally strong, intriguing, engaging, and somehow they're the same size, and we have the sense that they're equal in scale, and yet at the same time unequal, explaining Joseph's title. And it occurred to me, but it's Annie and Joseph. It's really so much like the 2 of them. So much, they were like a 2-person religious sect, so engaged with each other, but sometimes disputatious. And it seemed to me to be the perfect title for the book.
That's a question we didn't rehearse, because I sent you some things that we'd like to talk about ahead of time, but that wasn't one of them. And I'm glad I spontaneously asked that. I have the book sitting here because it's that elucidates a great deal, but it also strikes me as only one of the multifarious ways in which this title goes to the heart of things, because the book is obviously about the relationship of them, but as you were discussing it, embodied in a picture, which unfortunately we don't see here, it also reminded me of the whole paradoxical way of teaching, because how do you even keep these terms in mind at the same time? They're absolutely contradictory. Either you're equal or you're not unequal. They're kind of absolutes, and yet they've been paired in this title, which makes me think of them not only as makers, but also as teachers. And I hope we can talk a bit about that. But I wish you would elucidate a little bit more how you came to that house in, I guess, in Orange, Connecticut in 1972, because it's not everybody. You were, what, an undergraduate, a graduate student who were just roll up at their house?
Graduate school at Yale at that point. I'd like to just to say one more thing, because about equal and unequal, because you have so wisely referred to it paradoxical as a title. And I found that my mind instantly went to thoughts of how the Alberses met. And you had two people from very unequal backgrounds. Joseph was from not exactly poor, but should we say a middle-class workman's background. His father was a plumber, electrician, jack of all trades, a construction man, had very little money, and he was Catholic. And they lived in Bottrop, which was is an industrial city in Westphalia. Annie, 11 years his junior, was from a very different world. Her mother was from the Ulstein publishing family. Her full name was Anneliese Elsa Frieda Fleischmann. Her father was in the furniture making business. They lived just off of Kurfürstendamm in Berlin. She was brought up with the expectation that a woman should be able to instruct the cook what to make for dinner and tell the dressmaker what she wanted, and little more than that. And she was also from a different background because she was Jewish in her family lineage, yet she had been baptized and confirmed in a Protestant church in the Karl Wilhelm Gedenkkirche. So you have these people from very unequal backgrounds, and yet they met at the Bauhaus. Joseph arrived there in 1920, Annie in 1922, and from the moment they were there, in many ways, they were equal. They had the same passion, which was for visual art. The first Bauhaus Christmas, Walter Gropius was Santa Claus, and he was reaching into his bag of presents. And Annie, who was socially very timid, really, had no expectation that her name would be called. Gropius said the name, she didn't hear it. The woman next to her nudged her with her elbow, and Annie responded and went up. And what she received was a gift from Joseph, which was of Giotto's Flight into Egypt, a reproduction of the Giotto from Padua, a work that I studied extensively with Howard Davis at Columbia with a great deal of pleasure. And I think that in those ways, they were equal. They had this love for Giotto, for his values, for the rhythm, the color, the modesty. And so they were very much on the same plane, as unequal as they were in backgrounds. I'm sorry, I didn't even get to your question, which I could do, but you may want me to go in a different direction.
I'm already frustrated that we have only less than an hour to speak together, but I'm sure there'll also be interesting questions from people who are listening. You're encouraged to type them into the chat. But you of course referred to studying at Columbia, went on to study at Yale. This is partly an alumni event. I was wondering, this too is a question that only now occurs to me, did you ever encounter either of the Albers taught to you in an art historical context at the same time as soon you were developing a personal relationship with these two extraordinary artists, and then for many more years with Annie because she lived longer than Joseph?
Well, before I got to know either one of them, I had read an article, I think it was in Art in America, on representations of the square and the cube in art. And it included work by Don Judd, Tony Smith, and Josef Albers. And I had no personal connection with Albers, but I was intrigued by this because of a wonderful course I was taking exclusively devoted to Shakespeare with the professor Frederick Dupuy. He was marvelous. And I asked him if for a term paper, I could write on the relationship of the language of King Lear and minimal art. And I was inspired by that particular article. And with what I consider that wonderful quality of a Columbia education, which is always to allow you to consider the unknown, Professor Dupuy encouraged me. And I wrote about the relationship of that very simple language that Lear uses at the end of his life, and that desire just for the minimal, bare minimum of facts. He's blind, and he says, it is Cordelia. So I was writing about Josef Albers and Cordelia and going off in my Columbia College experimental way. Well before meeting them, I did not yet know Annie's work, however. And you asked how I met them during the story. You know, it's like many stories. The origin has a little bit to do with a degree of romance. During the summers at Columbia, very much enjoyed teaching tennis in New Hampshire in the mountains at a tennis camp. And I liked a girl who did not respond. I mean, it was one of those you're a nice guy, but situations. However, she took me to meet her family. And they had work by Anni and Josef Albers in their house. And marvelous collectors named Herbert and Ruth Agus. And they had the most carefully conceived, original, and breathtakingly beautiful collection, consisting largely of Joseph's homages to the square, Annie's weavings, work by Morandi, Ben Nicholson, and one very, very simple and refined Jackson Pollock, hung with great delicacy, with perfect furniture. And I was blown away. I mean, just staggered by the beauty of that house. And I continued to be friendly with their daughter as well as their other three children. And when I went to Yale graduate school after Columbia, Ruth Agus said that she would be in New Haven to visit the Alberses, and she invited me along. So that's how I got taken there.
I think we could spend the whole time just on equal and unequal. I was thinking maybe even for the audience, if we could conjure up without I'm an art historian, so whenever I'm anywhere without a PowerPoint or slides, I feel slightly naked and we have no images. But if we might conjure up a little bit, and I'm wondering for how many people listening tonight, maybe Josef Albers is already a known name, and maybe it conjures up one of the, I think you tell us, more than 2,000 versions of the homage to the square that he did. And maybe they think of that as a kind of singular obsession. We'll learn a great deal more about the richness of his evolution, but also the consistency. There's another equal and unequal, I think, in evolution. But what about Annie? I mean, how would you characterize, for people who only know the name Josef Albers, Annie? You chose to put her first, which I like very much. I think it's not just alphabetical. I think it's affection and slightly corrective and polemical. But what about, how would you characterize Annie, both in her own right and in this dialogue with
I would
the other Bauhausler?
as one of the most independent people I've ever met in my life. Totally original, never bound to any cliche whatsoever. And although she appeared to be very austere, and if you look at photographs of her, she doesn't wear makeup, or she wears very little makeup. She's dressed in a very, very simple but tasteful manner. She had a quality of exuberance, and that exuberance comes through in her writing and her art more than it did in her persona. The day that I met them for the first time, he was slightly dominant, talking more than she was and a little more animated, but she had a smile that was absolutely penetrating and that made me feel completely at home. And she had this tremendous force as a person. She was courageous, as I said, to go to the Bauhaus to begin with. When she told her father about this new school and new style, he said, "What do you mean a new style? There are no new styles. We've had the Renaissance, we've had the Baroque." And she persuaded him that this new style was acceptable, and off she went to the Bauhaus. She had that sort of tenacity and courage and originality. And as an artist, she was wonderfully spontaneous. She would work within the structure of weaving, of course, but then she would employ cellophane, metallic thread, all sorts of elements that other people wouldn't use. When I got to know her, she was really almost exactly the age that I am now, which is 73. And I'm very aware that at 73, she was experimenting like crazy. She was trying new printing methods, new textile methods, moving forward.
There's so much in what you just said I'd like to talk about, but the whole art of textiles, I think, is something that really is honored in this book, and her incredible inventiveness with textiles. And it's also part of what I like about putting her name first. And of course, it goes back to the Bauhaus. And you in this book, which was such a marvelous, I actually was sent a copy, I should say, by the publisher. So no one should think that I'm plugging this book in order myself to get a free copy, but it is the most extraordinary interweaving of things that only you know through your friendship with them, through your work with the foundation, through many conversations. So there's an oral history element that, I'll take an Annie metaphor, is woven into the book and into you as a kind of discrete interlocutor in this duo. You only even allow one photograph of yourself to appear in the book. It's the most, but the book is not only a conversation between the various text elements that are there, and you can dip into it for short or longer periods of time, but what appears to be initially a somewhat unusual exhibition in the mixture of media and things that will appear on one page, as you get a textile and a glass composition by Josef early at the Bauhaus, say, on facing pages, and you think for a second, what is this book? And as you pay attention to and spend time with those spreads, you realize that the book is talking to you as much out of the visuals of the design of the book overall, but the design of these juxtapositions on the various spreads, which I think taught me almost as much as the text itself. But I wanted to talk just a little bit more about textiles and Annie's thinking about them. And I like your comment that she's experimenting towards the very end. My one intensive time with her is in various fabric little swatches that were left to the Museum of Modern Art during my years there. And we looked through them a lot when we were preparing the Bauhaus exhibition a little over 10 years ago. And I learned for myself then what others already knew, that her textiles were not simply about color combinations, about visual experience, or even about textiles. She began to experiment with what textiles could do. And one of the most extraordinary are these acoustical ones, where the metal is not woven in simply to reflect light, but has an architectural element inside the architecture of the fabric, but in relationship in one very important case when she worked with the second Bauhaus director, Hannes Meyer, in creating the acoustical and the luminosity experience of the auditorium at this famous school that he designed in many of the Bauhaus. So I wonder if you could just talk about the evolution of that textile in dialogue. Everything that happens in this book is in dialogue. It's in dialogue between the two of them, but then it's in dialogue with this whole incredible cast of characters, whether they're secondary or not. There's a sort of cast of thousands that come across the stage of this book, other artists that they were involved with, that they influenced, that didn't even, it's not even a question of influence. They found interests that they shared. We'll go to that in a minute. But if you could talk a little bit more about the textiles, I'd love to hear your thoughts on it.
By all means, Barry, you're my dream reader. It's just an enormous joy to hear these responses and your visual responses and everything that you noticed, because you certainly, of all people, had tremendous knowledge of their work and of some of the characters in the book. I mean, you were the Philip Johnson curator at the Modern, and he is a major figure in the book. And when you talk about the surprising juxtapositions, I learned a lot in the process of making the book. And I'll give you an example. The section on the Bauhaus ends with a rug design that Annie made in 1933 that's owned by the museum, by the Modern. And I've never understood that design. I just seem to fit in with the rest of her work. It's a type of abstract form that you wouldn't know as an Annie Albers. One day I was in the offices of Phaidon when we were working on the project, and I suddenly, by error, had this image on its side, and I realized, my God, it's exactly the forms of a painting Joseph made at Black Mountain in 1942, 9 years later. And I don't think he borrowed from her. I don't think he knew her work. I mean that specific work. I don't think he had that one gouache in mind when he made his painting 9 years later. I think that they thought in parallel directions, and the visual juxtaposition speaks for itself, that there are certain things about angles and squares and white spaces that had poetry for both of them. You referred to the sound-absorbing, light-reflecting material. This was the piece that earned Annie her Bauhaus diploma. She was asked to design a light-reflecting, sound-absorbing material, and so she used metallic thread on the visible side so that indeed it would reflect light. And she said she used the qualities of velvet on the side that was against the wall because that way it would absorb sound. It is now being re-edited as that wonderful building by Hannes Meyer is being totally restored with as many original elements or copies of original elements as possible. And I think it was a workers' building, very much of a union mentality. And I think it's a wonderful combination of liberal values and great visual elegance. I had a wonderful moment at the Modern, by the way, and I'm looking at you, Barry. I always think of times in the museum, and it was when the museum did a wonderful clay retrospective curated by Carolyn Lanchner. It was a glorious show, and Annie at that point was very frail and in her 80s, but I organized to go to New York with her and a nurse and to take her into the opening, and there she was in a wheelchair. I said that she dressed austerely. She basically did, but that day she was sporting one of her homemade jackets, which she constructed out of very vibrant Thai silk. She loved a place called the Thai Silk Company in New York and got materials there. And she was looking at a clay, and I thought of her saying to me that clay had said to her that being close to a work of art is when it's looking at you. And observing Annie and the clay, I felt as if there was something going on between the object and the person that was extraordinary. And at that moment that I was looking at her, an elderly man with a white beard tapped on her shoulder. And she turned around in her wheelchair and she looked at him. And then she suddenly said, "Felix, ich kann das nicht glauben." Felix, I don't believe it. And it was Felix Clay, the son of Paul and Lily Clay, who Annie remembered as a kid playing in the backyard when the Clays and the Alberses had houses next to each other at the Bauhaus. The reason I got to that story is because Felix then introduced his wife. And his wife, in fact, Livia Meyer, was the daughter of Hannes Meyer. And when Annie realized that they were married, it was as if two kids from the hometown had ended up in a late life marriage. She was so warm. They were all so warm. They were warm human beings. They weren't the way too many people picture life at the Bauhaus. They were animated. There was a great atmosphere of love there. And she looked at Hannes Meyer's daughter and said, "Oh, I am always so grateful to your father who gave me my Bauhaus diploma." And she described the piece then. Barry, your voice has gone.
Sorry, I was I'm muting so that everybody doesn't have to hear the appeals of my cat to join in the conversation. Just thinking back to that textile with its acoustic and its sound properties, another, I think, feature that's woven through this entire equal and unequal, and I think it goes right back to the Bauhaus, is that combination of rational exploration and playfulness, which I think was at the heart of the Bauhaus. I'm thinking, oh, well, Annie designs this, diploma awarding piece of fabric, very performative for Hannes Meyer. We think of Hannes Meyer as the ultimate rationalist for the school that's been recently restored up to the northeast of Berlin, and it's one of its many scientific accomplishments. But a few years earlier, they'd all gone to the party, which was the metal festival. So they'd announced these themes for these parties, and everyone would pour their creativity in thinking, what can I do with metal? And then a little bit, there's basically turning the Bauhaus into a discotheque with things that are metallic, reflecting light. And so even this notion from the preliminary course, which Josef was so important in teaching people to simply play and work with one piece of paper and see if you could create a kind of universe of possibilities out of it by folding, by tearing, etc., and then talking about it. That combination of rationality and poetry, but playfulness, and I love the fact that it was alive right till the very end in this curious, exploring artist being wheeled around in a wheelchair and probably having as many vibrant ideas as anybody else, jumping up the stairs at the modern. I want to, because it's already after 6 and I know other people have questions, I want to bring in some of the cast of thousands. It occurred to me there's almost a rhythm in your book, and of course rhythm is very important in both of their works. There's a rhythm as we go from the duo of the equal and the unequal and try to hold that in our mind as a possible contradiction, to the trio that we've already mentioned, which is you as the behind the scenes friend, sometimes companion to Annie in later years, but also oral historian, and bringing your decades of experience with them to the insights in this latest analysis of the Albers. But what begins to surprise the reader as you move along, and I do think for many Americans, it's reduced to the obsession with the homage to the square. You help us appreciate that in the passages on it, but that is one element of this incredibly rich life. But that seems to be such a hermetic experiment, the homage to the square. And yet, I guess already with your perceptions that you were wanting to deal with minimalism across time periods and across media in your undergraduate exploration, from Shakespeare to Albers and back. What really strikes me is some of the people who initially, you turn the page and you're going to get 3 or 4 pages on yet another color of paper, because this is a color explosion, this book. And suddenly somebody comes in and you think, Buckminster Fuller. What is Buckminster Fuller doing entering this world? How in the world could the guy who did the geodesic dome at Montreal for the US Pavilion, those were moments when we wanted to portray ourselves as an advanced and advancing nation. How in the world is this person going to become involved with the Alberses? And as you engage not only with the story, but the visuals, it begins to make total sense. And like these kind of conversations in which the work of art talks back to you, the the casts of extras who come in turn out to be in a dialogue that's a two-way street. So there was one phrase I loved, which you quote from Bucky Fuller. You said, Josef and Annie have unfettered the creative genius in thousands of individuals. So, how do we get from that hermeticism to this connection with everything and everybody that crisscross their extraordinary life stories?
Barry, you evoke that beautifully because it's full of connections and crisscrossing. And when you think of that, what you call the hermetic element of the squares, it's completely true, but Joseph used to say, to follow me, follow yourself. And the squares were a vehicle for him, always to push color experimentation further. Annie used to say, you can go anywhere from anywhere. And she was a great believer in letting the unexpected happen. She was, after all, quite a good friend of John Cage. They had a tremendous mutual admiration, and the importance of spontaneity was major. I thought it was very significant when you said you would put on your mute because your cat was trying to be present, because I can't think that it was an accident that your cat wanted to be present when we were discussing Paul Klee, because you may know that Klee was quite obsessed with his cat named Fritz. And Annie used to talk about a time at the Bauhaus when Klee famously got into an argument on a train when he and Lily and Felix were going on vacation, because there was a question as to whether Fritz needed a ticket in the class car. And I also know that when they were all at the Bauhaus, this has to do with the importance of spontaneity. I'm not getting away from the subject, but in a way linking toward it, thanks to your cat, that there was a time when Eddie Warburg, who was instrumental in getting the Alberses to America, was visiting the Bauhaus, and he went to see Klee. He had recently come into some money and wanted to buy work, and bought 2 exceptional works. And he was in Klee's house at the Bauhaus, right next door to the Alberses, when the cat began to walk on a wet watercolor and make paw prints. And Eddie told me the story, said that he somewhat panicked and said, Herr Klee. Now, Eddie Warburg spoke perfect German, and he said, the cat is going to destroy your work, to which Klee purportedly replied, let the cat do whatever it wants, and then in 20 years, the art historians will all try to figure it out.
Well, we all know that paintbrushes were originally cat whiskers and cat. There's a very long relationship between cats and art, and I'm sure that this one might actually give us some spontaneity because he loves to appear on screen. But I think somehow a book that can bring us into their relationship, not only with Buckminster Fuller, but also with Ray Johnson, which is recently an extraordinary Ray Johnson exhibition down at the Zwirner Gallery, now that we're able to get out and see things again. And all of these, let's say this cast of characters who enter the book for both a textual and a visual appearance make us think about them differently and think, what is this universe that could include Buckminster Fuller and Ray Johnson? So that's just one of the many things that I love about having this book on hand. But there were 2 things that I'm going to be selfish, because I think we're going to start taking questions in 5 minutes or so. So people who might have them might begin to pose them. And I don't see that there are tons, so I appreciate that, because I like questions that are not formulated before the conversation happens. But 2 things that really fascinate me about the way we can think about 20th century abstraction in general. And that is, again, I suppose it's a version of the Hermeticism reflection. I think for many of us have always thought somehow that there was a divide in the 20th century. Either you were interested in figurative art and therefore you had a relationship to the history of art and you were a relationship to tradition, or you were trying to embrace abstraction, and this meant somehow a rejection of the past, a rejection of any admiration. You've already pulled the rug out of that just with the story of the reproduction of the Giotto given by Father Gropius Christmas. But also I love the idea of Gropius distributing gifts between two other people as a kind of intermediary. But I wanted to ask you just about two things that we know that both of the Albers came to really love once they arrived on this continent. And we probably don't have time to explore the whole notion of unsettledness and emigration, which is also a fascinating aspect of their lives. But they embraced two things. One, early on, this obsession, which I share with Mexico and with the pre-Columbian. From the 30s on, they're traveling by car in Mexico, and not just to Mexico City, but down to Oaxaca to see Mixtec culture, to see Zapoteca stuff, Aztec material, and they speak of their love of colonial architecture in particular in Connecticut. But this was something that they shared with Gropius, who loved the colonial architecture of Massachusetts, with Breuer, with whom they had a falling out, but Breuer also had this relationship to colonial architecture. So how do we account for this fascination with art of previous centuries, and particularly art that was not the art that they knew in Europe? This encounter was something that for which they didn't really have much preparation. Now you do tell us, and that really made me think a little bit differently, that they had already encountered Mesoamerican art in the Ethnographic Museum in Berlin, but I don't think they thought of it as ethnography.
They were open to anything and to everything, and they lived through their eyes. And just as the Giotto was that first Christmas present, Annie said that the first birthday that she had when she was a Bauhaus student was her 23rd, and she went home to Berlin, and the doorbell rang at her parents' house on Monikestrasse, and what was delivered was a small bronze copy of an Egyptian statue that came from the Pergamon Museum, and just an ordinary copy, and it was a gift from Joseph. And she kept that copy with her for the rest of her life. You can see pictures of her bedroom at the Bauhaus, her bedroom in Connecticut. It's always there at bedside. And I think it's perfect that it's a figurative object, but with all the qualities they loved in abstraction. Refinement, not a sense of the tragic, not a sense of the historic, but of something more lasting in effect. Annie also told me, they arrived in America in November of 1933, and there was a storm, and their boat, the Europa, was late in being able to dock because of the storm. Normally, boats dock during daylight. And so they didn't see the Statue of Liberty. And she said, now that was 33. The next time they went to Europe was in 62, because Joseph got a big prize in Dusseldorf, and they sailed both ways because he hated to fly. And when they were returning to New York, as they approached New York Harbor, they saw the Statue of Liberty. And Annie said they stood there at the railing of the boat, and she said to him, Huppy, there are times in life when abstraction is not the answer.
Oh, beautiful story. Gives you goosebumps. Well, what about that transition to America? We haven't even mentioned Black Mountain College, which I think is the wonderful. Most people have at least ideas about the Bauhaus. I think it's a much richer and more complex place than some of the pat stories we might have inherited or learned along the way. Many people know something, at least of the late Joseph. We keep referring to the homage to the square, but that became almost a ubiquitous element to the extent that I don't think many people even realized the richness of the color vibrations and the sensations that are embodied there. They simply it almost became a kind of background corporate symbol for many people not paying attention to it. But these intermediary years, which were so extraordinary at Black Mountain College, and indeed many of the interactions that we've already referred to, particularly you mentioned Cage, Buckminster Fuller, many of these people are going to intersect at this unlikely location in outside of Asheville, North Carolina.
Well, it was a fantastic experimental school. The office that you held at the Museum of Modern Art was very much part of the history of the Alberses getting there. Philip Johnson had met Annie in Berlin the summer after the Gestapo had padlocked the doors of the Bauhaus and asked her how she felt about going to America. She didn't give it much thought. Shortly thereafter, a telegram arrived inviting Joseph to make art the focal point of the curriculum at a new school in Black Mountain, North Carolina. The Alberses sent back the warning that Joseph spoke no English, and the instruction was to come anyway. Annie said they didn't even know where North Carolina was. She thought it might be in the Philippines, but she learned where it was located, and everything went very easily from there because they had devoted patrons who bought them steamship tickets and made the visa paperwork go through easily. And off they went to a place that was informal, full of financial struggle, with a wonderful atmosphere of playfulness and experimentation. Something about which I'm really proud on Joseph's behalf is the role that he had in having Jacob Lawrence be the first Black teacher at Black Mountain. And Annie made wonderful statements at faculty meetings, encouraging them to break the barriers of segregation, which in North Carolina in the 1930s was no easy thing. I mean, Joseph arranged for Lawrence to get train tickets with his wife Gwendolyn from the north so that by riding Pullman, they did not have to go into a segregated car the moment they crossed the Mason-Dixon line. And so the Alberses were a big part of the Black Mountain experiment. They were there from 1933 to 49. And that's where they encountered people like Merce Cunningham, with whom they had a wonderful friendship, and John Cage and Ray Johnson. And one of the things I enjoyed doing in the book was getting history straight to a degree. So for example, for some reason, there's a rumor that Robert De Niro Sr., who was a painting student at Black Mountain, threw his work out of the window because of Joseph's diatribes. And on the contrary, when you research it in depth and read the letters and so on, you discover that Joseph had the highest regard for De Niro, encouraged him in his painting, and saw to it that he got scholarship funds and returned for a second year. The Alberses could be very nurturing. They were very nurturing of Ruth Asawa, the wonderful Japanese-American sculptor who was there. And they did not care about big names or famous people or the usual success stories. They liked the people they liked.
I'm glad you brought up Ruth Asawa, because this is, again, a plug for the book. I think this is one of the things that's so illuminating about spending time with the book. Think, oh, Ruth Asawa comes in here, and you don't first think of these woven wire things as somehow necessarily having, just don't put it immediately in the same visual universe with the Alberses. And then once she's in their life story and in the pages and the illustrations are there, you think, well, this goes to just what you were saying. it is completely her project. But it is weaving, it is playing with wire, it is transforming things, it is the legacy of the Bauhaus preliminary course, the way Josef taught it, about discovering the capacities of a material and then playing with those transformations. But it's Annie's weaving as well, but it's space making. If you go to your post office, you can still probably get the Azawa commemorative stamp series, which I bought out in my local post office. But you know, an extraordinary underappreciated figure. And then it really does come from the interactions with both of them. And that, I think, too, is interesting. That's so, if you will, equal and unequal is their project, that most of the people who enter don't have a relationship with one or the other, but with this, you know, this extraordinary duo of equally unequal or unequally equal artists. I think it's in my stage instructions that I'm supposed to open it up to some questions. I still have plenty, so if people don't have enough questions to keep us going, I will just fire more at you, Nicholas.
Great.
All right, thank you both so much for getting us started here. We do have a few questions coming in. My name is Miyako. I'm the club administrator for the Columbia DC Alumni Club. And I'll go ahead and get us started. Like we mentioned, go ahead and type any questions into the Q&A. So I'll go ahead and start here. It's not a question. So this is from somebody who says their favorite quote of all time on art is from Josef Albers. And it's, "Thus art is not an object, it is an experience." And they've kept that in mind for many years. And they're an art and design professional, and said that they've enhanced many lives of their clients by giving them the gift of his words. And so he says now, thank you for providing such a wonderful experience today. So just to kick us off here. All right, so we have a couple of questions actually that are pretty similar. They're asking if you think the events or politics or religion of Germany in the 30s and into the 40s had any effect on their work.
It had a very strong effect on their work, which is that they thought that their work had to have values that were very different from the problems imposed by the political situation and by racism and by anti-Semitism and so on, that they chose not to go the route of the expressionists and paint in a way that reflected what was happening globally, and certainly in Germany. But on the contrary, they saw art as an alternative. They didn't deny the realities of everything happening around them. But Annie, particularly, from a Jewish background, feeling very fragile, saw art as a source of balance, and abstraction as a chance to have what she used to call a visual resting place. And Josef, in the moment that they were fleeing in 1933, did a fantastic work called The Sea. And you don't see any of the turmoil. You don't see all of the problems that a 45-year-old individual had, giving up the nation where he'd been born and leaving under duress and all of that. On the contrary, art for them was something above and different.
Okay, maybe a couple of quick questions here. One came in very early when we started. Edward asks if you could tell us what the coming exhibition at the Modern Art Museum in Paris next September will be.
Well, this will be a fantastic show opening on September 10th. Because of COVID, it's been postponed a number of times, but it will be an opportunity to see the Albers' work in very, very close juxtaposition. There's never been an equivalent exhibition. It doesn't create false parallels, but rather shows the incredibly harmonious relationship of their work and gives you a sense of the values and the working environment that they created for one another. This show will be extensive. beautifully installed, and will reveal many works by both the Alberses that have never been seen in public before. I know that not everyone can get to Paris, but if there's a chance of going, it's going to be fantastic, and on into the month of January.
Where did you say it's going to be, Nicholas?
At the Musée de l'Art Moderne de la Ville de
Great.
that great building right near Trocadero.
Right. Palais Tokyo. Great. Are there others?
Yep, a couple more here. We have, did you ever bring either of the Albers to the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, which is your hometown, Ingrid asks?
I didn't take either of them to the Athenaeum, but I know that they had a show there together in the 1950s, and there were beautiful paintings by Joseph in the Athenaeum collection. I once brought a patron of the museum to the Albers' house so that she could buy a weaving of Annie's, which in turn she left to the Athenaeum, and which will be in the Paris show, by the way. I'm crazy about that museum, and it is my hometown museum, but I know only of the Alberses going there at the time of their show, but I can assure you that what would have thrilled them would have been the Wallace Nutting furniture collection. That wonderful collection of 17th century indigenous American furniture was exactly the sort of thing that excited Annie and Joseph.
We had a question come in saying, did the education at the Bauhaus nurture an equal relationship between the two artists?
The education at the Bauhaus encouraged people to experiment, to go their own way, and did not particularly, certainly did nothing to discourage equality. Rather, it just encouraged everyone to engage with materials and techniques in new and original ways.
I think that was a bit, Nicholas, that's why I asked you the question earlier on about the textiles, because you do at least take a jab at that old, I don't know whether we want to call it cliche, truism, myth, that Gropius sent the women student to the weaving workshop, or at the very least to the ceramics workshop, because considered that those, so on the one hand you have this notion that the Bauhaus elevated what would have been called, I suppose, in the early 20th century, the minor arts or the decorative arts or the technical arts to the level of fine art. That was the very notion of the synthesis of these two schools, the fine art school and the decorative art school. But then on the other hand, it's often said that there was a bit of a ghetto for female artists, which at some points over half the students in the Bauhaus were women. So it's also, that isn't interesting, but that they were encouraged to go to the weaving workshop. But I think you refute that to a certain extent with Annie's story.
I heard Annie refute it, and first of all, there's a version of history which says that all she wanted to do was paint, but she was forced into textiles at the Bauhaus. Well, in fact, before going to the Bauhaus, she had gone to the School for Applied Art, the Kunstgewerbeschule in Hamburg, to learn about textiles. And she didn't like what she did there. She said that it was mainly needlepoint, which she called sissy stuff, and encouraged the sort of textiles with which she grew up, ornamental brocades and things like that. But once she went to the Bauhaus, she would have entered wall painting, but she couldn't. Annie had a physical handicap. She suffered from Marie-Charcot-Tooth syndrome. She didn't talk about it. I don't believe she knew the name of the syndrome until I was with her when a doctor referred to it in the 1970s, but she could not get on a ladder. She was very clear about that, and she wasn't strong enough to enter certain of the atelier. And once she was exposed to weaving, she went with it. I mean, she said that Paul Klee talked about taking a line for a walk. Paul Klee was the form master of the Bauhaus and of the weaving workshop, and she decided to do what she could with thread. And she responded to the limitations of the medium, as she always responded to limitations, by getting the most positive elements out of it possible.
I have one more question here from Mina, and then Barry, I'll throw it back to you to get the conversation going again. But Mina says, wholeness is not a utopian dream, which is something Annie wrote at the Black Mountain, the school that is the legacy of the Bauhaus in America. And she says, was Annie and Joseph's contribution a utopian dream?
Was it a utopian dream? To me, yes. I don't know. I think we probably all have different ideas of what utopia is. And, you know, the world is full of strife, and it was full of strife for the Alberses. And when they left Black Mountain College, it was because of a great dispute within the school. The Alberses emphasized that none of the institutions, whether it was the Bauhaus, Black Mountain, or Yale, was paradise. Joseph was forced out of the Yale Art School at the end of the 1950s. So there were not, the institutions were not utopia. If I want to think of a small utopia, when one went into the Albers' house and saw two people so dedicated to their work, pushing forward on new projects, Annie in her 70s, learning about photo offset printing, discovering techniques where she could apply forms of printing that had never been used for fine art. We think about Joseph designing wonderful wall reliefs to be built in Sydney, Australia. They were leading for them a rather utopian existence in a house that suited them. They were very grateful to have enough money just to survive. And so, even though I don't think they believed that there was such a thing as a global utopia, in fact, they certainly didn't. They weren't naive about the horrors of poverty and so much else that can exist in the world. But for themselves, they had a form of utopia.
I guess is it back to me then, or are there other? Maybe there'll be other.
Yeah, I'll
questions.
pop back in if more questions come up.
Okay,
but I think
you just let us know, because we can talk until the cows come home, and where Nicholas is, they might be on their way home because I think he's in a very rural location. Well, actually, let's just take a pause for a moment. Something I'm curious about. I would love to know a little bit the history of the Albers Foundation, because I always thought that it was of more recent vintage, but I came across a passing reference in the book to, I think, it being founded in 1971. Is that right?
Correct.
And so I wondered what the history of that was. So there's a certain thinking of the, besides the very moving part about designing their graves, which you end the book with, but there was a life beyond the grave in this conception of the Albers Foundation. So I wondered if you could fill in a bit the history of it. And of course, you have transformed it into a very dynamic and multifaceted institution. And I can thank you in front of all these people who are listening for hosting us when we were preparing the Bauhaus exhibition over a decade ago. We had a wonderful retreat at the Albers Foundation with a beautifully pals, but also very professionally organized. But what is the story of that from 1971? And to what extent do you feel that you're somehow maybe even in a séance with your old friends by your devotion to this foundation?
I love the idea of being in a séance with them, and I'm very happy to say that two wonderful colleagues, Edward Tatay and Wilhelm van Rooij, are creating a marvelous publication that is just about 50 years of the Albers Foundation. It was the wonderful arts attorney Lee Eastman who helped Annie and Joseph establish the foundation. Initially, it was created for reasons of taxes, which is that Lee knew and the Alberses knew that upon Joseph's death, Annie could inherit half of his estate without taxes through the marital deduction, but there would have been massive taxes on the other half unless the work went to a nonprofit foundation. And so a foundation was created so that a whole lot of money wasn't lost, but also so that the initial sums of cash in the foundation could serve various purposes. And the first project of the foundation, when Annie and Joseph were both still alive, was to sponsor a traveling fellowship in the Department of Anthropology at Yale for people going to Latin America and doing work in the fields of pre-Columbian art that so obsessed, joyfully, Annie and Joseph. Following Joseph's death, the foundation began to make gifts, and we gave a substantial number of paintings, 64 to Yale, and 91 paintings to create the Albers Museum in Germany. For many years, we functioned out of the Albers' house in Connecticut, but following Annie's death in 1994, we needed our own headquarters, and hence we ended up in Bethany, Connecticut on a beautiful 75-acre parcel of land, which is where you and your colleagues from the museum had your retreat. We have 2 artist residencies there. We have 2 artist residencies here in Ireland, in a marvelous farmhouse with spectacular views. And we have 2 artist residencies in Senegal. And our work in Senegal has become absolutely key to what the foundation does at the moment. It was beautifully explained recently in an article in the Financial Times saying that the Albers' values included minimal effort, the appearance of minimal effort for maximum effect. And our work in Senegal falls into that category. We've been able to help medical centers to build a school in a Muslim village. We've just recently completed construction of pediatric and maternity units in the city of Tambacounda because the needs are desperate there. So the Albers Foundation has moved into a very different area, but one very consistent with Annie and Joseph's values, with the issues of health and education being fundamental, and the African country of Senegal being our base of operation.
And how did Senegal enter into the picture? I know a great deal about the work, which is extraordinary, but I don't know how the Senegalese connection came about.
You know, Annie used to say, you can go anywhere from anywhere. And I took that very much to heart. And in 1999, I was in Paris installing an Annie Albers retrospective at the Musée des Arts Décoratifs and beginning to research the biography of Le Corbusier. And I needed a skin doctor and consulted the yellow pages, decided that the name Gilles de Gois sounded so French, and he was in biking distance, that I would go to him. Within 3 minutes, he was telling me about an organization he had created to provide medical help in rural Senegal, and that he and other doctors went there, and Barry, for reasons maybe not hard to explain. I think I understand them, but I just looked at him and said, "Je voudrais bien y aller avec vous, monsieur." I really wanted to go with him and see this work in Senegal. And I discovered that in this wonderful country, there were fabulous doctors and teachers, really people of the Albers' values, so dedicated to their work and to making human life better, whom we could help. And so Senegal, you can't be everywhere in the world, and a lot became possible there. So with relatively modest resources, which we're trying to grow, we're able to have a direct impact on human lives.
Maybe it connects to those one. I wrote down quite a number of sentences from the book that I particularly liked, but one which talks about something that we've only touched upon. Maybe it connects these two. You write, while others, this is about the Alberses arriving in America and the, with what was going on and what they had left behind. And of course, all of us in this country of immigrants always have that notion of to what extent you look over your shoulder, and do you look over your shoulder with sang-froid or with some kind of romanticism. But you write, while others would have lamented the need to move from one culture to another, the Alberses saw their new life as a treasure trove. Anyway, I think that's a little bit connected to
Very much. Thank you.
Discovering things of value and taking your values to a completely new location. That's one of the most moving things in, well, I think in general, the story, and you've been attracted to it as well in your book on other people who passed through the Bauhaus and then went into emigration. But that's one of the really beautiful things about this, is how these people stay true to themselves, but are also incredibly open to new experiences and to new places.
Yes, of course, it happened that they had each other. And their marriage, like all marriages, was full of difficulty and at times conflict, but they really had each other in their love and in their values, which I think was essential to the ease with which they could make these dramatic transitions in their lives.
I'm going to read one more sentence to you, and I'll tell you what, I'm going to read one more, unless, I'm going to play professor now, unless the audience puts more interesting questions, and I'm sure they're out there, in the Q&A for our remaining time. I'm going to just read you one more thing, and then I'm going to do, what is, everyone will remember this from their college experience, what is the easy way out for the professors? To give a quote and then just say, discuss. So I'm going to do that. But I'm sure there are other questions that are out there across all these topics that we've only touched upon. But this one comes when you start to speak of the role of optical illusion, which began, let's say, explicitly to interest Josef in later years. Although, like so many things that interest them, it's implicitly or intrinsically there in earlier work as well. But you write, the use of logic to create mystery was dear to both Annie and Josef, one of their most salient shared intentions. So I wonder if you could just unpack for a bit, discuss the use of logic to create mystery.
I've got my blue book in front of me, sir, and
yeah, we just actually had a staff meeting today in which we were going through everything we need to be ready for return to campus. And one of the staff members, office work people in the art history department said, we better put on the list to check and make sure we have a good enough supply of blue books, because I hear there are supply chain problems.
I actually think that system of education is wonderful, and it's an example of the point that you've just made, because there's structure in this idea of an exam, of summoning your knowledge of something and being ready to speak about it and explore it. And this is very much the sort of thing that was dear to Annie and Josef, the idea of Of course, you need structure, discipline, and order in order to become inventive. But they were happy to work within the confines of their medium and go with it in that way, just the way that blue book provides someone an opportunity both to present what he or she knows and to go further with it. But it's yeah, it's an interesting point, this dependence on the rigor and the discipline of what you're doing.
I guess I like that quote because I think it goes back to our very first part of the discussion about equal and unequal. If you can somehow hold the notion of equal and unequal, it's like Gestalt forms. If you can hold those two things in your mind at the same time, unresolvable paradox. I mean, even in the homage to the square, they're all squares, but they're not the same square. The same notion, if you can hold the idea that logic and mystery might have actually a productive synthesis or codependency. I think there were some questions that were popping up that looked interesting to me, so I don't want, I'm always able to fill the seminar room if the students aren't speaking, but our job is to hear what others have to say.
Yeah, I can jump back in. We did get some more questions coming in. So Maurice asks if you can talk a little bit about the relation of Annie's prints to her weavings.
Yes, her prints were a tremendous chance for exploration. The first thing that she said she liked about prints was that when you made them, you had more than one. When she made pictorial weavings, there was just one, and either she owned it or she sold it, but then it was gone. And she liked the idea of multiples. Then in weaving, she was always experimenting with technique and new materials. Same thing with printmaking. She began printmaking at the Tamarind Lithography Workshop in 1963, and by her description was just the wife sitting around. Joseph had a fellowship there, but then she was encouraged to make some of her own prints. She had this fantastic idea of using an acid bath to make a print, and then to create lines in such a way that they look both incised and as if they're floating, paradoxically. Barry, I love your return to the word paradoxical or paradox because it pertains in so many ways to the Alberses. Then, just as Annie experimented with the meander shape in weaving, very specifically, going back to the ancient Greek meander idea, she made prints of meanders, but she used a technique unique to printmaking of taking a screen, turning it 180 degrees, turning it again, and then finally overprinting it in a different ink color. So she used the process to create the result. This is what she did in textiles. She used the interloping of the threads and the knotting to create the appearance that was beautiful. She didn't disguise structure. And in her printmaking, you also see process very, very vividly and clearly. Her ability to experiment right to the end was remarkable, and her ability to use whatever she had, so that at the end of her life, she had developed a rather severe tremor. And because of her illness, her hands were not very muscular in any case. And she decided that rather than trying to create straight lines, which would fail, she would let the tremor guide her. And so she created beautiful prints based on stone walls that have an irregular line, very much like the edges of rocks in a stone wall. And then she hand colored these prints, and they're magnificent because there's someone adjusting to the realities of her physical disability and using them in the creation of something beautiful, which goes back to the beliefs that guided her textile work.
We did get a question that the link to the book didn't seem available, so we will look into that and send around some information tomorrow when we have the link to the recording, just so everyone knows. And then we had a couple questions come in about the relationship with Yale and that they went their separate ways in 1955. And Anna says she recalls a Josef Albers exhibition at the Yale Art Gallery in 1980, and it seemed like an attempt at an apology.
We're talking about different Yale administrations. Joseph felt very supported by the president of Yale, Whitney Griswold, when he was teaching there. And he felt that there were some forces in the art school who were against him. Indeed, they were. They didn't believe in Joseph's approach to painting and his particular disciplines. So in the late 50s, he actually left in 59. He was ousted, but there had been a very good show of his work at the Yale Art Gallery during his tenure there, by the way. And then his relationships with the university depended on who the individuals were. He was remained an associate fellow of Saybrook College for the rest of his life. It's a position that was passed on to me. I was quite honored knowing that Joseph had been a fellow there as well. But the gift made to Yale in 1977 of 64 paintings and a complete volume of prints. By the way, I'm looking at a wonderful cat in the background. Cats are a leitmotif of this program, but sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Thanks to that wonderful creature crawling across. But the exhibition in 1977 was because of the gift of artworks. And so it was really a wonderful museum director, Alan Shestak, who worked very closely with me on the selection of works and then on that show. It wasn't that Yale made a particular effort to make anything up. I don't think they particularly acknowledged what had happened in the 50s. So it's not as if there was something to make up. By the way, looking at your cat, I should tell you that my wife was remembering the other day a time when Annie was at our house and looking at the wonderful, majestic Humane Society, and Annie looked at the cat and said, over-designed. Goodness, Barry.
Yeah, no, he's great.
We're really just getting the cats coming in
Getting
now.
a cat culmination. Out of the way, Linus.
All right, we had a question come in asking if they had any children or how did their life and their work change as they went from collaborators into being married, and then if they did have any children.
They did not have children. And there are various theories as to why they didn't, and I really can't tell you all the reasons that they made this very personal decision. Except that the decisions that they made about how to live, how to be married, what sort of house they wanted, their lack of social life, which was very deliberate, were very much their decisions. My mind just did a sort of going anywhere from anywhere because Barry asked about colonial architecture, which I'm relating to their marriage because in 1975, I realized that May 9th was going to be the Albers' 50th wedding anniversary. And a few months previous to that, I asked Annie if I could organize a party and invite her brother and sister, relatives, friends, or so on. Absolutely not, she replied. Joseph and I do not waste time on parties. And yes, they'd gone to some great parties at Black Mountain and the Bauhaus and wore wonderful costumes of their own making, but they were not very social people in the sense of liking parties, and they certainly didn't like the art scene. That did not appeal to them. So Annie said no to this anniversary idea, but then I knew that on the day of their anniversary, they drove to Litchfield, Connecticut. And it suited them perfectly because they simply loved the two main streets of white colonial houses there. And there was a good place where they could have lunch. And Annie, I asked her the next day, did you or Joseph acknowledge that it was your wedding anniversary? And she replied that she had seen that on his desk calendar, he had circled the date. So she knew that he knew. And she said, and we didn't shout at each other once all day long.
Well, it's impressive after 50 years. So we have a question from Barbara. She asks if Annie was involved or supportive of other contemporary women artists, especially in New York City.
Annie was supportive of a handful of artists whom she knew and admired. They're not, there was the artist Sybil Wilson, who lived in Bridgeport, Connecticut, whose work she admired. We've talked about Ruth Asawa. She admired the weaver Lenore Tawney, but she wasn't part of the scene in any particular way.
Okay, maybe one last question here. Somebody asks if the Albers reconnected with Bauhaus colleagues in America, and I'm sure I'll say these names wrong, but there's Gropius and Feininger.
Yes. Well, they did indeed. The Feiningers used the Albers' house one summer, and there was a nice friendship with their son, the photographer, Lux Feininger, and they stayed in touch with Gropius. It was Walter Gropius who got Josef Albers to do a fantastic mural in what was then the Pan Am building. It's now 200 Park Avenue, and this is something of which the Albers Foundation is very proud. I mean, to answer Barry's question about the foundation, we were able to do things like really go to the mat to have that mural reconstructed. This is a mural that one goes under when entering Grand Central Station from 200 Park. And we worked and worked until we could get it rebuilt. And it's a great joy to see things like that happening. But that's Gropius. And Gropius also had Annie do wonderful textiles for Harvard graduate student housing. She did room dividers, she did bedspreads, Joseph did a fireplace up there. So they were certainly connected with Gropius. Barry referred to the schism with Marcel Breuer, which was an unfortunate one and something Annie tried to rectify, but just a case of a misunderstanding and stubbornness. But they were friends for a long period of time. And they also stayed in touch with their American colleague, with their Bauhaus colleagues who did not get to America. And Josef Albers worked very hard in his effort to get Wassily Kandinsky to go to Black Mountain College, but Kandinsky was not willing to leave Europe.
Okay, well, I think we're just about out of time, so maybe if we can go to Barry for some closing thoughts, and then we'll come back to you and go ahead and close out.
Thank you.
Well, I would just thank whoever had the idea of inviting me to be part of this. Led me to reconnect, at least virtually, with my friend Nicholas, but also to spend time with this in a focused way with this absolutely wonderful book, although it is really designed as something that you can go to for a short or long time and go back to over and over again. Are there other, I guess I'll just say in closing question, are there other aspects of the Albers' work that you think needs exploration in future? The show a number of years ago. I think it was at the Guggenheim on the Alberses in Latin America. Was just spectacular and a real revelation to me. And then time after that, I went to Mexico, where I also go frequently. I even felt at times I was looking at certain things through the Alberses' eyes. Are there future projects?
Great question, Barry. And there are always future things. Joseph's furniture was wonderful, and we're very interested in reeditions. We're interested in reeditions of Annie's textiles, and we're interested in new uses of their work. Today, I had a meeting with people running the hospital, Georges Pompidou in Paris, not the museum, but the hospital, because we're encouraging the use of Annie's and Joseph's art in hospital settings. There's a spectacular project in London at St. Mary's Hospital where there are murals and glass partitions and room dividers, all based on designs by Annie and Josef. It seems to me that their vision can be realized in totally new ways. Within the existing body of work, there are the more than 100 figurative drawings Joseph made prior to going to the Bauhaus, which are beautifully executed and a wonderful unknown element of his work. And then always new possibilities. You know, if someone wanted to take a Josef Albers stained glass image and realize it in some new form, we're all for it. Joseph used to say, to distribute material possessions is to divide them. To distribute spiritual possessions is to multiply them. And with our work in Senegal and these other undertakings that I've mentioned to you, we really hope to enlarge the pleasure that's brought by the Albers' work and the real values, the wonderful morality that underlies it.
Amazing. Well, thank you both so much for spending your evening with us. Again, all of our alumni clubs here. We did record the talk and discussion today, so we will send out the link to the recording tomorrow. It is on our YouTube channel, so if anybody's watching, it'll probably get posted a little bit earlier there before I can send out the email after work. But it was really great having you both, and thank you so much. Have a great night, everyone.
Hey, everyone. Great to talk with you.
Barry, thank you so much. You're great.